Look at insider threats. We're going to walk through some educational elements, and then we'll take a look at how to detect and respond to them inside of the organizations. When we look at insider threats, it's important for us to understand what are we talking about when we're describing an insider. And in the realm of computer science, it can be broken down really into three different types of objects. The first is the actual human being, the insider that can betray the company and do things that are undesirable. The human being doesn't have access, doesn't have the ability to interact directly with computer networks and the data on them. So the person has to use an endpoint like a computer, a laptop, a tablet, those types of things. And in executing that, we use credentials through authentication to connect that person to an object inside of the network, a user account, and those types of things. So credentials are normally passwords or certificates or something along those lines. And each one of these have their own vulnerabilities and threats from those vulnerabilities. When we're talking about the insider, really everything that's worked through the history of humanity is on the table. So I've listed some of the vulnerabilities here on the table. These aren't exhaustive, but they're a good sampling of things that are often exploited in converting an otherwise loyal or good employee to a threat to the organization. So we think about things like ideology or disgruntlement. We saw this motivation with Edward Snowden. He wasn't happy with the way the NSA was handling data, and so because of his ideology, he turned on the organization, on Booz Allen and the NSA to really steal information, to embarrass the NSA and have a conversation. And really, for that to happen, to manipulate that type of vulnerability, we just need to recruit individuals and encourage that type of ideology. Financial hardship, that's a big one, or just greed. Money is a big part of the way we live today, and why would an attacker need to spend hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars in man hours trying to break into a network and steal data if a $20,000 or $50,000 bribe to an administrator or an insider would work? This is one reason when background checks are done, particularly inside of the federal government, that the financial status of someone is investigated, because if you are underneath the weight of debt, the prospect of getting out of that is very appealing. So we have to watch for that. Fear, if there is something in our past that can be brought to light to really, from our perspective, ruin our lives, that fear can be manipulated through extortion. And we also see situations with criminals creating these circumstances by orchestrating situations where the insider could be put into an embarrassing or compromising situation than extorting their cooperation. Loneliness, the human condition, we need to interact with other people, and so the offer of friendship or romance becomes very appealing. And so posing as someone's friend or partner is really effective, not just in computer security, but in all types of espionage. Love of family is a very powerful thing, but it does create a vulnerability in the sense that if a criminal kidnaps a member of your family, you will do things you would not ordinarily do to safeguard them. Same thing with self-preservation. We like to protect our bodies, and because of that, torture and or threat of torture even is a powerful motivator. ego, boredom, those are other things that are just wrapped into the many ways that a human being can be manipulated into doing something that they would not ordinarily do. And so, getting a hold of the insider is actually much more powerful than the credentials or the endpoint from some reasons we'll talk about in a bit. Credentials, we target credentials a lot. These come up in the news cycle pretty often, but weak passwords can be easily cracked. 8 characters that are lowercase only take a couple of minutes to brute force. So more complicated passwords are needed. We share a lot of information on the internet. There's public records that are easily accessible now that were not in the past. So things like birth dates and where I was born, my mother's maiden name, all those types of things, even the first car I drove, or things that someone could find out if they were researching me. And they could build a personal dictionary of things. And if I'm using those words, using those birth dates, using those anniversary dates, those personal markers can be used to crack passwords pretty quickly. Also, human beings don't like remembering a lot of passwords, so we tend to reuse them. And so my password on Amazon.com or Facebook.com may be the same password that I'm using at Lancope to access corporate information. So if someone was able to successfully attack one of the web services or public services that I'm using, they can try those stolen passwords in other usages, like my corporate account. The other thing is, as human beings, we operate in analog, so we need to get data into the computer, and we do that largely by typing. And you can do this a few ways, but if, for instance, if the guy in the next cube was watching you type your password in, he now knows your password. Also, with new camera technologies, things like GoPros and other HD recording devices, you can set up a recording device pretty simply just to record the entry of data from a physical context. And we also have malware like keyloggers that are gathering information as you type it in and sending that out. So, again, just the process of getting those credentials into the computer. The other is transmitting the credentials. So if you're normally logging into a server that's physically distant from you, and so there's a network between the endpoint and that service. And so particularly in environments like cafes and those types of things, man-in-the-middle attacks can occur to where a fake access point is stood up, and the endpoint connects to that access point. The access point is capturing all of the information as it's in transit, and you can steal a lot of credentials in a cafe in a day with a man-in-the-middle attack. The other is dealing with the endpoint, and so the endpoint, the biggest vulnerability to that is there's a human being that has all those vulnerabilities we're looking at before, clicking things, installing things, going places that are ill-advised. So, the end result of that is malware becomes installed on the machine. The nature of endpoints on networks are they have to communicate with each other, and because of that, there are going to be open network ports, and those open ports provide a way for attackers to connect and manipulate that machine. And once they're inside of that machine, can then manipulate those credentials that occurred during authentication, and then use the authorization given to those credentials as well. We're also seeing problems in the supply chain where as machines are being built and configured and those things are happening in an assembly line type of process, there are more ways to get malware, whether it's command and control software, key logging software, but some type of malware onto the machine. And also it's customized for that machine, so it's very hard to detect. but if that's done in the supply chain, then it shows up at my desk, and then Charles Herring logs into his new laptop, and outside attackers then have access to my credentials and can impersonate me, not just on this endpoint, but all of Lancope's endpoints. Another issue is that walk-up like we're talking about with credentials, because the machine's physically here. I was just yesterday with a customer. We went to lunch and came back, and his coworkers had decorated his computer with a big warning that let him know that he forgot to lock his computer when he left. And so, it was good of them. Just, they were well-natured in that prank, but it is a real problem. If I leave to get a cup of coffee, we leave our desk many times in the day. A malicious insider might use his coworker's computer and steal his coworker's credentials so that he's not caught. So walking up to the endpoint after it's gone through the authentication and authorization process, and then another user using it is a problem with that endpoint. So, in these talks, we like to bring up statistics and talk about how big of a problem it is. And frankly, there's not really great statistics here for a number of reasons. Insider attacks don't tend to use or don't have to use malware. If you have credentials and you can log in and abuse those credentials, there's no need to install malware. There are some occasions, as we just discussed, where you would, but there's less malware than we would see in other types of attacks. And because of that, there's less evidence. There's less things to look for. There's less indicators of compromise. Insiders, particularly when the human being is the thing that was exploited or taken control of, is they have the ability to cover their tracks. This is a human being that's thinking and nimble. If it's a technical insider, then they actually have the knowledge of the network. They know when people come to work. They know physically where the devices that they're interacting with are. They know what tools are being used for data collection and analysis. And that makes it very difficult to catch them. And so, again, that creates a situation where it's very difficult to actually know how prevalent this is. We do catch some of these. They are caught, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. But just wanted to point out that building accurate statistics here and useful statistics are very difficult because as things are currently, as an industry, we're not great at catching these types of attacks. Actually, we're miserable at catching these types of attacks. So there are increasing tools. There's another issue. You can go into chat boards. There are books written. If you want to be an insider, whether it's for activism, an ideological reason, or if it's for a criminal reason, there are help desks that can be called now, and you can ask for support in doing criminal activities. So there's just a ton of tools and knowledge that were not available in days past that make it very easy to be an insider. And then lastly, the way law enforcement works is we catch an individual after they committed a crime, and the fact that we catch them deters other individuals from committing a crime in the future. The challenge we have in insider threat and computer science and in InfoSec is that it's difficult because the insider was the insider the person, which is the one we can put in jail, or was it a theft of credentials, or was it a compromised computer? And drawing all of that together, putting that whole picture together, and being able to attribute the attack to the actual human individual is difficult. It's very challenging, and it really requires a full law enforcement investigation that is technically complicated. So with that said, there are some good statistics Carnegie Mellon's CERT put out. And in this chart, they broke down the motivations, or three ways of thinking about the motivations on insider threats. One was IT sabotage, which, as you can imagine, is generally connected with ideology or disgruntlement. Financial gain is pretty straightforward. It's you're stealing information that you can sell, whether that's cardholder information, PII information. And then business advantage is normally when someone is leaving an organization, they're going to collect strategic or competitive nodes. It might just be the Rolodex, could be something worse than that, but where you collect it so you can use it in another endeavor, your next job, or something along those lines. But some key things to point out are, one is you'll note that in IT sabotage, they didn't use their own credentials, right? But in financial gain and business advantage, they almost always use their own credentials. And there's a couple of psychological reasons to this. But you do note that in IT sabotage, the IT sabotage tends to come more heavily from the actual IT staff. But this number, again, is low, and it may be low because we're not actually detecting some of these events from the technical users. The main takeaway here is that logs are how we how we caught the individuals. It's going through logs and seeing things to get it attributed back to the initial attacker, to the insider. So we're going to spend some time talking about how to detect and respond to insider threats. But before I do that, just a couple of notes. There are some things we can do to reduce the vulnerabilities. We talked about background checks. Inside of the Department of Defense, we do security clearances, and so part of that you look at has the person participated in crime in the past? Is he connected to criminal elements? So that's sort of the bedrock of the background checks. Second is looking at the financial situation, as I mentioned. If someone does have debt and a financial stress, that's a weakness that can be manipulated through bribery or some other means. Ideology, if there are, depending on the organization, there are going to be some ideologies that are going to pose more risk than others. And so, of course, doing these things requires an employer to enter into the privacy of the employees. So there is there's need to evaluate the pros and cons of privacy here, and it's outside the scope of this presentation, but that is one way to reduce the risk, and also those background checks need to be ongoing. People, their lives are always changing, situations are changing, and so if you're going to go down that path and fully, then it does require ongoing monitoring. As far as securing the credentials, username and passwords are really a ridiculous way for us to authenticate a user, a human being, to a user account, but we've been doing it for so long and we're so used to it that we are having challenges moving away from it. But multi-factor authentication, things like expiring authentication tokens are another way to improve credential use, and that's one of the ways I think corporations over the last 5 or 10 years have made it much harder. Certificate-based authentication, so whether that's on a smart card or common access card, those types of things, where you're doing username, password, maybe a biometric to unlock the key. Those certificate-based infrastructures, while they still have a different set of risks that go along with those, are certainly much more secure than dealing with passwords. But if you are going to deal with passwords, a policy that makes them cryptographically complex and difficult to crack or expensive to crack, and then changing them, those are very important. And also using dictionary words from that personal dictionary, doing that type of filter to make passwords better are important. And then as far as the endpoint, you have to control the supply chain, so saving a few dollars saving a few dollars on the purchase of the computers may cost you big as a company. So making sure that you're using reputable, secured supply chains, that's important. Hardening them, meaning reducing the amount of ways that that the endpoint user could make a bad decision or install bad software. Those are all important, as well as things like advanced malware, sandboxing, and AV, and those types of things are important in that regard. So last year we did a webinar on looking for the weird, which really is exploring the theory behind network behavioral anomaly detection, or NBAD. And we're looking at how we catch things. How do we catch insiders? We tend to look at the three buckets here, the three ways that it's possible to catch anything. The first is signature-based detection, and on signature-based detection, what you're looking for is very specific patterns, and normally it's from the object entering the victim. So packets entering the computer, files entering the computer. So the object you're inspecting, the file or the packets normally. Behavioral-based detection is focused on what the victim does after he's ingested the object. So after the file has been executed or the packets have entered the machine, what does he do? Because while we might not know every poison, every bad packet, every bad file, they tend to do this, similar things once the machine is compromised, scanning the network, disclosing information, breaking policy, those types of connecting out to known bad places of the internet. So, behavior is watching what does the endpoint do after being infected by the object. And then anomaly-based detection is similar to behavioral-based, but instead of looking for known bad behaviors, we baseline what is normal. And as a host begins to deviate from that, that gives us increasing concern. Inside of StealthWatch, we use a concept called a concern index, which is an integer assigned to every host. It's between 0 and infinity. And a machine that is doing everything perfectly normally compared to its peers will have 0 points of CI, and something that is deviating very far from normal will have hundreds of thousands or maybe millions of points of concern, depending on how collectively abnormal the behavior is. And this model is important because behavioral-based detection helps us understand how to make a new signature. So, if there's a new attack, we won't catch it through signature-based detection because we've never seen it before. We don't know how to build a signature. But the behavior will tell us, okay, wait a second, there's a bad behavior. What file or packet is connected to this bad behavior, and then we're able to build a new signature. And same thing with anomaly-based detection. When there are new behaviors that are occurring, like we saw with Heartbleed, where we didn't know what signature to look for. We didn't know the behavior being memory dumps coming out of the servers. We didn't know to look for that. But from an anomaly perspective, those types of connections were very strange. They're not normally how HTTPS connections work. So in that, anomaly-based detection helps us build better behavioral checks. Behavioral checks help us build more signatures. And so, taking a holistic look, we're able to use all three of these inside of StealthWatch to give a clear picture of what's going on the network. We're also challenged in insider threat because there's not really anything we can do from a signature perspective. If an insider is accessing data, well, they're supposed to access data. So there's no signature that we know to look for. Very similarly with behavior, while an insider might do a bad behavior like scanning the network, they have the opportunity to already know what's going on inside the network, right? So there's probably not going to be a known bad type of behavior that they're going to do. The things that are going to be caught with insiders are normally going to be around anomaly detection. A user that normally accesses only a few megs of data in a day, accessing terabytes of data is highly anomalous. And we saw that with Edward Snowden, where Booz Allen had him on contract to help with the administration of the NSA servers, so he had to access servers. But he should not have been collecting large amounts of data. That was an abnormal or anomalous type of communication compared to the other administrators working in this group. So, some examples here. This is one type of an anomaly for the organization. In this case, Ethel, 1 hour and 33 minutes ago, here was located in Boston, and then 18 minutes ago, somehow she showed up in Atlanta. And this is probably not possible to move that fast, but these become even more scary when Ethel's logged into Atlanta at the same time that she's logged in from the Far East or something along those lines, which tell us that her credentials are being abused. Data hoarding. So again, this is something that we use inside of StealthWatch for dealing with that Edward Snowden type of situation, where every host inside the network has an amount of expected transfer. So in this case, we mathematically calculated that this type of host should have collected less than 100 megs over a monitored period of time. But in this short window of time, very quickly, almost 11 gigs of data was collected. So that triggers what we call a suspect data hoarding event. We also have a corollary to this called target data hoarding, which is when a server normally serves out some amount of information, maybe 100 megs, but today it served out 11 gigs. So it allows us to focus on distributed data collection. Again, just looking for normal traffic patterns and mathematically calculating that. Inside of StealthWatch, we do that on a rolling 28-day baseline, and then as individuals begin to deviate, the concern goes up and eventually alarms. Same thing on data loss. So if users send information out of the network. So in this case, this is a pretty high threshold, but this type of machine normally sends out up to 500 megs of data, but on this given day, it disclosed more than 8 gigs of information out of the network to the internet. And so, we see both of these events, both data loss and data hoarding, in multiple scenarios. Right? This could be staging of data, where it's the controller of the attack is actually using stolen credentials from the outside and are staging information, and then eventually they're going to exfiltrate it. This same type of data hoarding, I saw it a few weeks ago with an executive who was preparing to leave the company and was collecting as much information from the network as he could to help him in his new venture. So both of those scenarios are very common. So that's really detecting them. The other thing that we can do is get better at collecting evidence. And if I was to go down the street and rob a liquor store or a bank, I wouldn't be stopped by lasers or guns or drop floors or those types of things. I would be caught by the surveillance. It would be human beings that would have seen me. Seen the car that I drove away in. There would have been cameras involved. There would have been evidence. And because that evidence was collected, and law enforcement can come after me. And law enforcement doesn't stop laws from being broken. They catch individuals after the laws have been broken and create a situation that deters future crimes from happening. And so because of that, criminals really fear evidence. They don't like evidence. Evidence is what gets them caught. And unfortunately, we really have focused almost all of our logging and detection on outsiders trying to get in. So we focus on perimeter-based logging. But focusing on internal to internal conversations is critical. And with metadata logging like with StealthWatch, NetFlow logging like we do with StealthWatch, we can potentially log every conversation inside of the network for for months or a year. So I'm working with a customer this week that just set up 18 months of data retention of every conversation across the organization. But another problem in these audit trails is detection has to be quicker than data retention. So if we only have 6 months worth of records, it only gives us 6 months worth of time to detect there's a problem. And because of the issues we looked at earlier, we do need to get better at detection so that when it is time to do an investigation, the evidence has not been written over. So when we talk about this evidence, where do we collect from? What do we look at? There's a handful of things from the network perspective that we can collect. Firewall logs are good, but again, they're very perimeter based, and it's important that we log everything. And in the recent past, it was challenging to do all that through syslog, but firewall manufacturers like Cisco and Palo Alto put out their firewall logs now in NetFlow or IPFix that has the user information that it's aware of, the permit denies, and so that metadata, that IPFix or NetFlow, can be collected by a flow collector and aggregated with other network data sources in a very intelligent, context-rich way. Same thing with IPS, whether it's on the network or on the host. Log management is collecting syslog is important. There are some things you can't get out of NetFlow, like authentication failures particularly, or AV patterns being matched. So it is important to not just collect the NetFlow, but also collect syslog and have a way of going back and looking at that when doing investigations. And then the third thing we look at, we have NetFlow, we have syslog, and then we have PCAP. And the challenge of PCAP is it's just very heavy. It takes a lot of storage. Processing it retroactively is a computational nightmare. But there are situations where you just have to have PCAP. And because of that, you're normally going to put it at some strategic choke points, those that are looking at protected assets, the crown jewels and the rest. And then, relying on NetFlow to give breadth, so we can log every conversation across the network using NetFlow, but then use packet capture in strategic places where we really need to get deep inside of the packet. So those are really the three areas to focus on: syslog, NetFlow, and PCAP. So, looking at NetFlow, one of the reasons that it's critical from an evidence perspective is it's just so easy to leverage the existing infrastructure. The router, we don't have to deploy probes everywhere. We're not having to deploy tabs. It's really just a matter of putting into our standard config on our routers and our switches and our firewalls the export of NetFlow. So as those devices are routing communications or moving them around the network, they give us a log on every single conversation, and that is a very powerful component in catching and deterring insiders. The other thing that we can do, and I apologize for the resolution on this, but in the blue column there on the left, I have highlighted client user, and it's Ethel in all of these. But because these devices are aware of user credentials, firewalls like Palo Alto and Cisco ASAs are aware of the users that are connected to the conversation so that they can apply policy to them, that information becomes available inside of these forensic records, these NetFlow records. And so there's nothing scary. There's one thing to connect a conversation back to an IP address or a MAC address. It's a whole other thing to connect it to the human being, or at least the credentials being used in the attack. And that's another deterrent, and it's also powerful in investigation. There are going to be some investigations that are going to start at the user level. Strange behavior, conversations noted, the background checks are coming back strangely, an individual's getting ready to leave the organization, and you want to pay closer attention to what they're doing. And so inside of StealthWatch, leveraging this identity context, we can start an investigation at the credential level, looking at the username, pulling back user snapshot, pulling back the communications they've had, where their credentials have been used anywhere around the network. My history with Lancope goes back to 2002. I was the network security officer at the Naval Postgraduate School, and we were collectively working with Lancope and Georgia Tech, and where the research for StealthWatch began, in building out this full intrusion detection model with looking for anomalies, behaviors, and signatures across the network. And over the last 15 years, StealthWatch has evolved into a tool that gives a complete visibility, not just around NetFlow, but also the context of the context connected to the communications, context like the user, the MAC address, the physical location on the network, the business units and departments that the users are connected to. Taking the business logic and laying that over the information being collected is very powerful, and as a result, we've been able to help more than 700 customers over the last 15 years. One of the conversations that have been coming up is really this idea of using StealthWatch as the network is your sensor, right? This idea of just turn the lights on the network, send the data via NetFlow into StealthWatch. StealthWatch will use context integration with things like Cisco's Identity Services Engine or other identity components to correlate user and endpoint data like MAC address and physical location to the conversations to give some of those workflows that we looked at earlier. And so answering the question of who's doing it, what applications are being consumed, where are they physically located, whether it's an inside user or an external attacker, the time and the methodology, all of those are very important in both detection and in response. So, as soon as we spin up StealthWatch, we spin up a flow collector and an SMC, and we start sending NetFlow. As soon as we see NetFlow, one side effect is we build host profiles on every host that we observe. So what that gives us is a full inventory of endpoints on the network that are generating traffic, and what services they're running, who's logging into them, and so forth, very quickly understanding that. Again, hit on this in the last slide, but recording every conversation, storing it for a long period of time, and being able to easily query that data during investigations. Determining what is normal, and that's no small task. No organization has one normal. Every organization has many different normals, and so as a result, we have to spend a lot of time figuring out what that normal looks like. Alerting to when there are changes, whether they're known bad changes, known bad behaviors, or if they're just anomalous changes, either impacting the business, a misconfiguration, or breaches like the ones we're discussing today. And really, our ability to store that information for a very long period of time is one of the key reasons many organizations rely on Lancope and StealthWatch. So all of that together just develops what we call context-aware security, not just login, not just analysis, but full context around what's going on inside the network. Deployment is pretty straightforward. Minimum deployment of StealthWatch is a flow collector. The flow collector receives a NetFlow, parses it, does really all of our intellectual property, all of our checks against those conversations. And then the flow collectors are managed by one SMC. We tend to see one flow collector on each continent. They're massively, there's several different models with massive scalability, and we tend to put one on each continent in global organizations. And parts of the network that can't generate NetFlow, or we want a richer set of data, Flow sensors can be plugged into taps or spans to generate that rich net flow. And they can also be installed inside the virtual estate with using the flow sensor VE. Simplifying change control, we use the flow replicator or UDP director to send net flow, syslog, or SNMP to this device, and then this device sends the necessary information to the flow collector or other tools, network performance tools, application tools, SIMs, and the rest. But it radically simplifies change control, reduces the bandwidth necessary to move that data around. And then pulling in context through Cisco's Identity Services Engine or the Lancope Identity solution. And that concludes the session. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. You can reach me at charing@lancope.com or on Twitter at Charles Herring. Thank you very much.